Welcome back into another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Oldham with you as always. Happy to be here once again on a Wednesday, midway through the week. And if you can't tell through the camera, I'm not super sure. I don't have the most powerful, clear camera in the world. I mean, it's not horrible, but it could be a better camera. But if you can't tell, and maybe this is something I shouldn't share, but I do like to share different aspects about my life, especially when we get things rolling here during these shows sometimes. I'm very tired this morning, and there's a reason for that. And it's funny, on Monday, whenever I made the announcement about my wife being pregnant with our daughter, I had mentioned leading up to it, like I didn't have like a job announcement, but I actually kind of did at the same time. It just wasn't the time for that. But those of you may know, I had been working at iHeart in the afternoons regularly for the last couple of years. I'm still at iHeart, but because of some shakeup, as of this week, I have been working the early mornings at iHeart, meaning I'm getting up at 3:45, and I'm talking 3:45 a.m., of course, and getting to the downtown Louisville studios around 4:30 and doing the morning shift on our news station until 9 o'clock. And then I come back here, and on days where I will record, this being the first iteration since I've started that, trying to get used to some new stuff. But hey, for any of you who have ever done a shift change like that, something that drastic, I'm sure you know what it's like because, I'm feeling it. I'm running on probably the last 2 nights, got maybe a total of 9 hours of sleep, which some people may be like, oh, that's nothing, man. I've slept on 2 hours of sleep for 4 days. And I'm sure that's not true, but, I'm definitely, hopefully it doesn't come through on the show because I am in a good mood. I'm not, angry about anything, but, sometimes life changes happen for the worse, right? I will say this. I do feel like at least as of yesterday, the very short sample size I have of doing this new shift, it makes my day feel longer. Like I can get more out of my day. So that's definitely positive. But the negative is definitely trying to figure out this new sleep schedule. But nonetheless, welcome into In Touch with Indiana Sports. Appreciate each and every one of you for joining. As always, if you're new to the show, welcome in. I don't know how you found us, but I appreciate you sticking around if you decide to do so. And maybe hit that subscribe button before you head out. And if you feel ever so inclined, hit that notifications bell as well to be let know whenever anything we put up on our YouTube page, whether it be this show, whether it be talking about the Hoosiers, whether it be the post-game wrap-up shows that we do for Indiana basketball and football, all sorts of good stuff. And I appreciate, once again, I feel like I've said that a million times already, trying not to get in my head as I, go through this show, letting you guys know what's been up with me. And still a lot of good things to talk about. Last night we had the college football playoff rankings reveal, right smack dab in between the Champions Classic games between Kansas, Michigan State, and then, of course, Kentucky and Duke. And we'll talk a little bit about those games here shortly. And not like I'm going to break down each and every portion of that game, just kind of reaction to what happened and some of these early results you have 4 of the bigger names in college basketball facing off each and every year in this Champions Classic. And one of them, a Big Ten team that's unranked. And, they've always, I'll go ahead and say this, Michigan State's always felt like the odd man out when it comes to the Champions Classic. And I'm sure some of you will let me know this, unless this is incorrect. But I do believe back when Tom Crean was the head coach at Indiana and they were forming the Champions Classic, Indiana was invited to participate in this event, and they declined it because I don't remember the exact, maybe I'm wrong about this. No, I know they declined. Was it this or the CBS Sports Classic that they had to decline? I think it might have been the second one that I just mentioned because Ohio State ended up participating in that event. It's the event with UCLA, Ohio State, Kentucky, and North Carolina. Similar style of event, though, where you have opponents that rotate each and every year where it's the same group of teams. But yeah, I remember that event Tom Crean denied because of the Crossroads Classic that took place in Indianapolis formerly. And I'll say this, I kind of miss the Crossroads Classic just because it was a very unique thing. It was a very Indiana thing, of course, to have with Indiana, Notre Dame, Purdue, and Butler. But I get why people didn't like the event, especially because it kind of took up a weekend where you could schedule a marquee opponent. And you never know. I mean, most of the time when you face Notre Dame and Butler, those two teams, especially nowadays, aren't going to be the same caliber of opponent as, say, a Kansas or even a North Carolina, a Duke, any of those teams that face off in these other events where you kind of not round robin it, but you rotate each and every year who you end up playing against. So we may talk a little bit about more of these matchups here in a little bit. Just wanted to go ahead and mention that because I was getting into the college football playoff rankings as Indiana found out their latest fate when it comes to what the committee thinks of them as they continue to march toward the end of the regular season and potentially move on to the Big Ten championship game. And from there on, the college football playoff. So let's take a look real quick for those who did not get a chance to look at the college football playoff rankings. I'll go ahead and run through them here really quick. Oregon stayed at number 1. Ohio State stayed at number 2. And by the way, I just realized I think I'm looking at. Oh, never mind. I'm not. So one thing, I understand how this works, but every time I look at the bracket, it confuses me. So again, I'm sure I'm not the only one confused with this, or at least that gets it mixed up every now and again. But of course, the top 4 seeds go to the top highest ranked conference champions. Because whenever I was getting into that, I know Ohio State is the second ranked team, but because they would be behind Oregon as the projected Big Ten champion, Ohio State moves to the 5 seed. You had a lot of shakeup like that last night, and especially affected the Big Ten because the Big Ten being so top heavy in the rankings ends up sliding them back so that much further. At least it felt like that. At least, but I feel like, so here's the thing. I'm looking at the bracket. It makes me feel like I need to have a ranking in front of me as well to be able to say this correctly. But, I'll just give you the seeds of the bracket because honestly, that's all that really matters for what we're talking about here. So Oregon being the number 1 seed, Texas the number 2, BYU the number 3, Miami the number 4. And from there on out, Ohio State is the 5, Penn State the 6, Indiana the 7. Look at that, all in succession. Ohio State, Penn State, and Indiana. But when the rankings, I believe their rankings were 2, 4, and 5 respectively. And I know Indiana for sure was the 5. But because they back each other up with these auto bids that the conferences get, that's why you see Indiana backed up all the way to a 7 seed. And that's very unfortunate because when you are perceived as the 5th best team, but you have to be backed up a little bit because of seeding rules, that puts you at the less favorable path as you make your way through, the college football playoff tournament. But moving forward, Indiana being the 7, Tennessee's the 8, Notre Dame is the 9, Alabama the 10, Ole Miss the 11, and then Boise State the 12. Another interesting thing about where Boise State was, they were just outside the top 12 in the actual rankings portion of it. I believe they were number 13 and Georgia was number 12. But because of the rule where the 5th ranked highest conference champion, I think that's what it is, gets an auto bid as the 12 seed if they are not somewhere else in the rankings, that pushes somebody who would have been the 12 seed on the outside looking in. So if you're Georgia, you would have been the team left out in this iteration of the college football playoff rankings. And so let's look at Indiana's path here, shall we? So in this hypothetical scenario, and by the way, this is kind of the reason that on Monday's show, I didn't do the CFP projections, the hypothetical projections anymore, because this is done for us now, except it's done kind of officially, even though this isn't the true tournament just yet. This is where things would stand if the bracket was indeed today, correct? So, looking at Indiana's path as the 7th seed, they would be the host in this scenario. And it's a very fun scenario, but also kind of a daunting scenario, just when you consider the tradition and history of the team they'd be playing against, the Alabama Crimson Tide. And granted, this is not Nick Saban's Alabama, it's Kalen DeBoer's Alabama, but that also adds another level of intrigue because, of course, Kalen DeBoer being the former Indiana Hoosiers offensive coordinator back during one of their better seasons in recent years before, of course, Kurt Signetti arrived this season. And so a homecoming of sorts for Kalen DeBoer would be very interesting in that scenario, especially in mid-December when really the temperature and weather conditions at that time of year could be very unpredictable. I mean, it's not guaranteed to be, 15 degrees and snowing, but that's not necessarily out of the realm of possibility once you get to that time of year. It very well could be 50 degrees and mildly almost said sunny, but I think these games we played at night, but could be mid 40s in a mild style of weather condition for that particular game. But again, you always got to think about those possibilities. And if Indiana were to beat Alabama in this scenario, they move on to play Texas. So back-to-back teams against some of the SEC powerhouses. And I'm sure a lot of the Indiana doubters would love to see the Hoosiers play this route simply because it will just give them an opportunity to, from the get-go, if Indiana doesn't beat Alabama, they'll try to just deny that this Indiana team was ever legit in the first place, right? Because they'll be like, oh, the Indiana, they don't play in the mighty, mighty SEC. They don't get to play the likes of Alabama and Texas every single week, which, again, there is truth to that. But that also, it doesn't necessarily mean that Indiana is a bad team, right? They can be a step below the elite of the elite, potentially. We're going to get a taste of that here in about a week and a half when Indiana faces Ohio State, and we'll really find out if the Hoosiers belong amongst the elite when it comes to the Big Ten Conference and or really college football in general, right? And if let's go ahead and talk about this a little bit. We've thrown this out there a little bit a few other times, right? But looking ahead to next week's game against Ohio State, I think there's a couple different ways things could play out, of course. Let's just talk about the positive, right? Indiana goes into Columbus and wins. At that point, you've all but solidified your status of being in the college football playoff, right? Even a loss to Purdue at that point, which won't happen, but even a loss to Purdue wouldn't kick you out of the ranking because you would have that marquee victory on the road against Ohio State. They'd really kind of cancel each other out if you found a way to indeed lose to Purdue in that scenario. But anyway, if Indiana does beat Ohio State, I mean, they could potentially march themselves into the Big Ten championship game and be playing for, and I say potentially, they would be in the Big Ten championship game, and they would be playing for the 1 seed against Oregon. Oregon would be defending their 1 seed, of course. And again, this is assuming they stay undefeated. I think there's a real chance that this weekend, Oregon should be on upset alert against Wisconsin on the road. Not that Wisconsin is that amazing of a team, but we've yet to see Oregon play a really close game recently. And I think they're due for another one here shortly. And it wouldn't surprise me if it comes against the Badgers this upcoming weekend. But if we get to that scenario where both teams are 12-0, that's a battle for the 1 seed, right? So that could be a very interesting way things play out. But back to what we were talking about with Indiana versus Ohio State. And we already talked about the best case scenario. Let's talk about the second best. And it's really not even, if you're an Indiana fan, of course, and you want them to win, any sort of loss is not a good thing. But this would be, if you're ranking these different scenarios, 1 to 3, this is number 2. This would be a close loss to Ohio State, of course. And I think this would include any loss that is 10 points or less. And I don't know what the spread currently is on this game. I do think there was an early line of Ohio State minus 14 that I think got all the way down to 9.5. And I'm trying to pull it up right now to see if there is any such thing. So right now, as it stands, Indiana at Ohio State, the line is minus 10.5, of course, in favor of the Buckeyes. So I think if you stay in that, if Indiana covers, of course, as I just mentioned, I think that should be enough to please the playoff committee. And again, they won't necessarily get the most favorable seating at that point, but I think there's still a decent chance that if you finish off your year after that loss to Ohio State with a big win against Purdue, and I say big as in you beat them by a sizable margin, I think Indiana could still be competing, not only just to be in the playoff, but to potentially be hosting still in that scenario. So that's the second best case scenario. This is the nightmare worst case scenario if you're Indy. Now, nightmare actually would be losing to Ohio State and Purdue, but I don't even want to humor losing to Purdue just because it just seems that far out of the realm of possibility. But with the worst case scenario, that would be you go into Columbus in a week and a half and you get absolutely slaughtered. And I'm talking, let's just say Indiana lost the game 49-14 in kind of a similar fashion in the way that Indiana beat Nebraska. I don't want to say that Indiana would guarantee themselves to be out of the playoff, but you definitely give anybody who's doubted the Hoosiers all season long that really what they've been looking for, and that's okay. This is all because Indiana hasn't played any of the elite teams. They don't belong in this college football playoff. So that's the scenario that you, of course, want to avoid. And again, we've never seen a Kurt Signetti team unprepared. So I think a loss like that would mean that the team comes in unprepared. And I don't think Ohio State is that much significantly better than Indiana on paper. Do they have more talented guys? Probably, and that's okay. But I think we've seen more of a better team from multiple outings from this Indiana squad versus Ohio State. And I think a prime example of that is common opponent, the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Both Indiana and Ohio State got to play the Cornhuskers at home. Indiana beats them 56-7. Ohio State nearly gets upset at home by that same Nebraska team a week later. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in a week and a half. And of course, we'll dive deeper into that as we get closer. So just wanted to go through some of those scenarios. Of course, it's a very exciting time for Indiana football, and I'm enjoying every second of it and looking forward to the day where they actually, where we see how this ends up. But I'm not trying to wish it all away. I'm going to enjoy this bye week this weekend, and hopefully we'll have something exciting to talk about once we get to that game on Saturday, and and beyond there, of course, as well. So we'll put the football talk to bed for right now, and we're going to bring in our man Alec Lasley to talk a little bit of Indiana basketball, because of course the Hoosiers are off, the football team is, and South Carolina will be coming to Simon Scott Assembly Hall this Saturday to take on the basketball Hoosiers, the Mike Woodson Hoosiers. And so right now we'll go and play that for you as myself and Alec discuss what we've seen from really this Indiana basketball team through a couple of games and what to expect. Publisher of HoosierIllustrated.com, Alec Lasley, with us once again on a Wednesday. Going to talk a little Indiana basketball. Alec, welcome in. How you doing?
Good, John. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. I've been having a great time watching Indiana football, but it's a bye week this week for the football team, of course. And in place of that, we're going to have Indiana versus South Carolina, Power 4 versus Power 4 this Saturday at 3 o'clock. And really the first action, I hate to call it legitimate competition because I'm not really too sure how good this South Carolina team is going to really be. But it's definitely a step up when you compare them to the likes of, an Eastern Illinois or an SIU Edwardsville.
Yeah, I mean, it 100% is. And, this was the kind of the one game that everyone kind of circled outside of the Bahamas to really kind of look at Indiana and have somewhat of a feel of what they'll be like going into Big Ten play. And, a lot of people got off to a really bad start when it came to looking at South Carolina this year when they lost to North Florida to begin the year, right? So it's a team that is vastly different from a year ago when they made the NCAA tournament. If this was last year's team, all right, this would be a really good non-conference matchup. They lost a lot of key pieces from last year. It's a much different roster. especially at the top with some of those top players, especially Michi Johnson, obviously going to Ohio State and leaving South Carolina. So you lose a lot of kind of that major punch that I think you would be, willing to kind of take on with this sort of matchup. There's not a lot of upside and only downside, in my opinion, when it comes to an end result against South Carolina. If they win, great. That's what they theoretically should do. If they lose, that's going to, significantly hurt what is already kind of a, realistically not that very good of a non-conference resume when everything is all said and done, unless they go out and win the Bahamas, which through 2 games, I think, again, it's just 2 games, but through 2 games, you're not super excited about where this team is at, especially with the energy level. I think that's the biggest thing. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to have moments where they look really, really good. They're going to have moments where they, struggle just because they do have so many new faces. But I think the more concerning part through 2 games has been the constant with Mike Woodson teams. And it's the inability to play a full 40 minutes, and more so the inability to play with a lot of energy and enthusiasm for a full 40 minutes. You can struggle on both ends of the floor, right? But if you're at least playing with energy and you're playing with some sort of enthusiasm, you can let some of that slide. And, through 2 games, they're not doing it. And it looks, very similar to, at times, what Indiana looked like last year.
What do you think was the biggest difference between the first and the second half, specifically with Eastern Illinois? Because, of course, they were down by a point and they ended up winning pretty handily when it comes to the way they played in the second half. Do you think it's just a matter of, getting up and being ready to go, as you mentioned, from the beginning of the game all the way through? Or what do you think it is that will keep them from, just having those slow starts?
Yeah, I think it's just that, right? I mean, it's a Sunday tip. Those
right after a football game.
Yeah, when they're not conference games, even when they are, Indiana struggled in Sunday game last year a little bit, but even when it's not a Big Ten game, right? It does not have a lot of that, major oomph that you would want from a weekend game, and the crowd wasn't great. There just wasn't a lot of excitement in the arena, and the group obviously didn't do a great job of creating any sort of excitement in that first half. So that's that's been the biggest concern, I think, for anyone watching Mike Woodson teams, is just that inability to be ready for any kind of matchup. And you can tell within the first 5-6 minutes, kind of right when you reach that second media timeout, what this first half is going to look like, and kind of what the rest of the game is going to be set up to be. And you kind of got that right away with just a very lackadaisical effort on both ends of the floor. I mean, the defensive, I guess I should say, the inability to really slow down an Eastern Illinois team that, again, does not have a lot of firepower, was really concerning to start. I think they were averaging almost 2 points per possession through the first, kind of 10, 12 minutes. And that's obviously not going to cut it when you're playing anyone. But more specifically when you're playing, Power 4 Big Ten opponents. And so that's something that they're going to have to work on. But I think at the end of the day, right, that, this team has the talent this year that they're going to be able to kind of sleepwalk through some of these non-conference games. And I think that's the most concerning part, is they couldn't do that last year. And that's why you saw a lot of those games become extremely close in the last couple of minutes. They can do that for, 30 minutes against a lot of these opponents that they're going to face outside of the Bahamas. And they could probably still win by 15, 17 points. And, you look at the final score and you're like, okay, but it's what comes in those, in those 40 minutes that I think Indiana fans are really looking to kind of grab onto something and be excited about. And again, they just have not shown that for the most part, outside of, Mackenzie Mbako's obviously had a really phenomenal start to the year. Bryson Tucker had some really good moments against Eastern Illinois. Still trying to figure out a little bit of that backcourt, but Trey Galloway's looked really, really good and comfortable in his role, right? So there's still some really good parts that you can take from it. But just as a whole, it's just not what you would want from a team that, let's be honest, you look at the rest of this Big Ten, especially now Purdue losing Jacobson. The Big Ten is extremely wide open. And I think even coming into the year, right, the expectation, even with the preseason rankings, Indiana finishing second, I think the expectation, right, was that this was almost Indiana's to lose based off of the talent top to bottom. And that's just not from the outside looking in, right? That Mike Woodson specifically said this is the most talented team that he's had. And there's going to be a lot of people that continue to harp on that if they do not wake up and really play to the level that they can. But again, we did this, we do this every year through the first,
Yeah.
week or two of the season, right? The overreactions and everything. But I think it's just the fact that there was just so much talk coming into this year about what this team could look like. And they're just vastly on the other end of the spectrum of, I think, what a lot of people wanted to see through, again, a couple games.
And they're not the only team that has had their early season struggles. I mean, this is pretty typical to see. Like, you look at the preseason top 25, of course, and I know we're only a week or so into the season, but as these early non-conference games play out, you're going to see a lot of teams take beatdowns. I mean, maybe not necessarily the way that you saw with like Gonzaga and Baylor per se, but you're going to see some of these teams that were expected to be one thing, and they won't necessarily be something completely different. But some of these teams, it just takes a while for all of these pieces to mesh. I guess you could say that maybe Indiana could potentially be, one of those cases that I'm talking about. And you also mentioned there a second ago, Mackenzie Mbako kind of taking the jump that he has through 2 games. And again, very small sample size. And I've kind of talked a little bit about it on previous editions of the show the last few days. But, and I've heard Mackenzie Mbako say specifically that he credits a lot of this improvement to his defensive ability. Would you say that that really is kind of what has sparked his early season success? And do you think that this level of production is sustainable for the rest of the season for him?
We'll start with the second question first. I absolutely do. Maybe not to the extent, right? I mean, I think he's at 25, 26 points a game. I don't think that's sustainable. But
Yeah.
the efficiency that he's playing with, I think, is definitely something that he can sustain throughout the rest of the season. Just again, because this team does have a lot of different options, and he doesn't have to force anything. He's clearly the most talented offensive player in terms of an ability to get their own shot and just a true scoring ability. I think Miles Rice can get there, but he's definitely struggled, I think, trying to just kind of force the issue a little bit too much. But Mackenzie Mbako, I think the biggest thing with him is not only defensively, but he's just playing with a lot more aggressiveness with every sort of movement, whether that's cutting to the basket off the ball, whether that's making any sort of move in transition on the perimeter to set himself up for an easy bucket, whether that is with the ball in his hands. He's not forcing the issue, but he's very demanding with the rest of his movements. And I think that's the biggest thing is you just didn't see a lot of that, really confident, aggressive mentality last year. Especially right in the first month of the season where he only scored 25 total points in his first 5 games. So, he was really trying to find himself. And I think you just see a much more confident, relaxed player this year. And it's obviously shown through 2 games, but a lot of it, whether it's on the defensive end of the floor or off the ball offensively, he's just a lot more aggressive and not hesitant in anything that he does. He's playing a lot more proactively than he is reactionary. And that was a big issue with what he was doing last year, especially on the defensive end to start. But he's just a lot more confident in general. And you're seeing that. I think it obviously helps when you see the ball go through the basket. But he's started a couple other ways, again, with his ability to play with just a little bit more confidence, aggressiveness, and that translates into what his offense ability has been up to this point.
And Bryson Tucker, he would be probably the player that most would say has been the biggest surprise so far. And again, just through 2 games. But what do you think he's been able to do to kind of create the looks in the offense that he's gotten, and really just as somebody who is a freshman and the only freshman on this particular team, true freshman at least, what do you think he's been able to do that has really made him kind of an important role player for this Indiana team for the first couple of games?
Yeah, I mean, he's a lot more versatile than I think a lot of people, really knew about him. He's a guy, obviously, that I think just in general, a lot of people didn't really know a lot about coming into the season. Didn't play on, any major AAU circuits. Was not a guy that was, super, um, you know,
Like
heavy
nobody,
in
and I don't mean
into
to
the
interrupt,
media.
but because he didn't commit until after Liam McNeely decommitted, and it was so sudden and really kind of random. There was never really kind of a tracking of this guy's recruitment, and so we didn't really know a whole lot about what to expect from him. I feel like coming into the season.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I think a lot of people were, they saw the McDonald's All American name, right? They saw the 5-star ranking, and they expected a lot, but they didn't really know what that consisted of. I think he's done a phenomenal job, kind of fitting in what his role is, and that's playing with energy, being a factor on both ends of the floor. I think defensively is where he was always going to make his mark first. Can guard multiple different positions, super long, especially with this team that wants to create a little bit more of that transition game. A guy that fits in there with the ability to take the ball off the dribble and really move the offense in the break, or play on the perimeter and on the wing, and be one of those outlet passers, or outlet receivers, right? So he just has a lot of different ability that I don't think a lot of people knew about. But he's very patient. His ability to really be confident in his game, again, as a freshman, I don't think a lot of people have. He's very confident in his body and what he can do. He's not trying to do too much. And I thought it was interesting. He played a lot more on the ball, in terms of kind of a main or secondary ball handler, against Eastern Illinois, something that Mike Woodson touched on very briefly in the summer, as something that could potentially happen, to maybe move a guy like Canyon Carlisle off the ball, or Miles Rice more off the ball, or Trey Galloway more off the ball, because Tucker does have that ability. And he did a really nice job with that. He's never going to be a super dynamic playmaker with the ball in his hands for teammates, but he does have that ability to kind of take a little bit of the weight for a couple possessions off of maybe one of those other true ball handlers. And because of his size and versatility, and a little bit underrated athleticism, he can get right to his spot, which is about 15 to 17 feet, and pull up and rise up over a smaller defender. And once he does that, that starts to open up a little bit more of his overall offensive game and slashing ability. But I think you have to be super excited about what he's done, and just how confident he looks out there, albeit against two lesser opponents so far.
One thing that we've heard complaints about from whether it be fans, just outside observers of the Indiana program in the last few years is really the lack of 3-point shooting. And I think through a couple of games, including the exhibitions, we've yet to really see, a vast improvement in that. And I think this team still has better shooters. But one thing that I've not really been afraid to mention so far is I truly do not think that we're going to see Mike Woodson veer away from what he's been kind of known for, and that's relying on his bigs to kind of really set the tone for what he wants to do. And that doesn't mean that he's not going to want to have, better looks from the 3-point line, but I think it's safe to say, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think it's safe to say that we're still going to see a very paint heavy style of offense. But at the same time, I think throughout the season, we're going to realize that because of the personnel, whenever Indiana does take 3-point shots, I do think they are going to be more efficient, whether they're taking a whole bunch more compared to usual or not. Now, you still don't want to be in the 300s when it comes to 3-point shooting attempts when you're a team like Indiana. That just seems like a recipe for disaster. I do think you'll see that number go up. I don't know how significantly, but I don't think we're going to see the change in style like maybe some people were hoping for or maybe even expecting this season.
Yeah, and I think there's two parts of that. I do agree that through the first couple of games here, we've seen a lot more of a post presence, and a kind of almost a forcing of the issue with trying to establish that front court and then work into the back court. I think a lot of that has to do with just not a full confidence in the transition game up to this point. We've seen it in spurts, but it hasn't always been there. And the half court offense has really struggled when they have had to kind of figure out what they're going to do. I think that at the best, right, it's been with Trey Galloway, the ball in his hands, a high ball screen with Omar Ballo or a high ball screen with Malik Renew opening up the floor, him getting downhill and then finding whether it is Omar Ballo on the pick and roll for an alley oop, or if Omar Ballo is coming from the backside, the open side of the floor there for an alley oop. And it's still going to be a heavy dose of what's going to happen in this paint with the front court. But I think you're just going to see it in multiple different ways. Omar Ball is not a back to the basket player, and we've seen through the first couple of games Indiana, try to force that, and it just has not been super successful. He's not going to be able to do that against more talented bigs, and so I think you're going to see a very consistent effort to try to open up the floor with a lot more of those pick and roll opportunities, or even pick and pop. We've seen a lot of small ball lineups so far. And I think a lot of that just has to do with, Langdon Hatton maybe, not being that guy who can come in and play, 12 to 15 minutes a game as a backup. And they really don't have a lot of depth, obviously, in that front court. But I think that's going to benefit them, because it's going to have to almost force Mike Woodson to play small, play 4 around 1, and really limit the 2 post players, because that's when Indiana gets into trouble, is when they have 2 of those guys within, 5, 6, 7 feet of the basket, and you clog the lane, and neither of them are great passers in Malik Renew or Omar Ballo at this stage. We've seen at times Renew can be that guy, but he's not shown it consistently enough. And so, that was a lot easier when you had a Trace Jackson Davis, who really just created so many more opportunities for those perimeter players. Even if the double team does come with Ballo and Renew, they just don't have the passing ability yet. So I think you're just going to see, again, a more concerted effort to really try to play small, still be able to force the issue with that one post player. But it's just going to open up so much more if you only have one big guy in there, because they just aren't good enough passing the ball yet. And again, we haven't seen through 2 games the ability to, outside of McKenzie and Baca, the ability to really knock down any sort of perimeter shot consistently enough.
Last question. Who is one player you want to see take a significant step forward against South Carolina this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy 2 answers, right, are that starting backcourt. It's Miles Rice and Cannon Carlisle. I think eventually you'll get there with Cannon Carlisle. He's still kind of that odd man out, really trying to find specifically what role he needs to play. But I think you need a much better showing for Miles Rice. He's really struggled in the first 2 games in terms of consistency and in terms of really limiting the turnovers. He's forced the issue at times in transition, and I think that's going to be okay in moments, but he needs to learn how to play in multiple different speeds and not just go all the time. And I think this is a really good matchup to be able to do that. South Carolina, obviously coming in a much different team than what Indiana's seen up to this point, and possessions are going to matter a lot more. And I think, and I hope that's something that does translate into this weekend's game with South Carolina. But I think you definitely need a better showing from Miles Rice, especially going into the Bahamas, for him to at least get some more confidence and showcase that ability as the point guard there.
Yeah, Indiana will have South Carolina and then UNC Greensboro before their 3-game Bahamas stand, where you'll start off with Louisville, then the winner or loser of Gonzaga and who is it? West Virginia in their second matchup, I believe, but one of those 2, I believe, and then a myriad of teams over on the other side of the bracket. So we'll dive deeper into that as we get closer. But Alec, I appreciate your time as always. Always plenty of good insight, whether it be football or basketball that we talk about.
Appreciate it, John.
Shout out to Alec Lasley, as always, for his time and, of course, a great knowledge on everything we talk about. That's right. I'm buttering up the boss right now, the boss man, Mr. Alec Lasley. I'm sure he feels like a big head honcho up in his ivory tower at HoosierIllustrated.com. Of course, I say that jokingly. But appreciate Alec. Good conversation. Looking forward to getting further into basketball season because, as I've mentioned time and time again before, it's been very interesting to really see how I react to this, not only the Indiana football team being outstanding, but trying to balance football season with basketball season. Because normally, whenever Indiana football is not doing well, it's very easy to transition into full Indiana basketball mode once the season gets rolling. And not that we've ever ignored football completely. Now, maybe some of you have, and that's totally fine. But I've always liked to see the season ride out whenever, even when things were going bad, just because I've always, and this might sound weird, I've always been Indiana football first. And maybe always is a stretch because I did grow up, being an Indiana basketball fan as a kid. And like it all started with basketball, as I feel like it does for most Hoosiers. But at the same time, ever since I've been to, multiple games, whether it be for football or basketball, I always knew that football was the beginning of the sports calendar. And so that's why I've always kind of, I don't want to say I've had a soft spot. Maybe that is what it is, but I've always wanted to see the football team succeed. And maybe part of it is also seeing other teams succeed and feeling like I've missed out on the fun. Where this year we're having the fun. And I'm very glad we are. So staying with basketball, though, I want to dive a little bit back into the Champions Classic that I referenced earlier. And a couple different matchups took place last night, sandwiched before and after the college football playoff rankings show. First one being Kansas against Michigan State. Of course, the number 1 ranked Kansas Jayhawks taking on Tom Izzo's Spartans. And this game, and it wasn't necessarily a bad game, but there was only a few times during this where Michigan State really kind of threatened to make a late push against the Jayhawks. And when it came down to it, they were able to pull away. And they don't really look like a dominant number 1 team yet. And I don't necessarily think that there's going to be that team this year in college basketball. Maybe it eventually shows its ugly head and we find out that UConn's on their way to three-peat, that type of thing. But I don't think Kansas as a number 1 is something that's, going to be a mainstay for the, the entirety of the year. You never know. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but Kansas is still very similar to the Kansas team that they were last year. I know they've added Wisconsin's AJ Storr and a few other pieces. Of course, Hunter Dickinson returned, one of the most important pieces they could, have. Moving on to the other game, we had the number 19th ranked Kentucky Wildcats taking down the number 6 Duke Blue Devils 77-72. And what a signature victory for Kentucky's Mark Pope. And wow, I heard the pee pop whenever I said that. That's disgusting. Sorry about that. Maybe I should move the microphone a little bit away from my mouth so I'm not popping the peas into the microphone the way that you're not, taught not to do. Excuse me. But yeah, Kentucky gets the upset win against Duke. And maybe we'll find out later this year that this Duke team wasn't as good as they were billed to be. And I'll tell you what, though, they do have one of the most highly touted freshmen on their team, of course, with Cooper Flagg. And I'm sure Kentucky is going to wear that win as a badge of honor, as they should, considering, I don't want to say Kentucky didn't have a lot of hype coming into this year because they were able to manufacture enough of it with Mark Pope and what he was able to do in the transfer portal to where, I don't think it was necessarily all hype. I think there might be some actual substance to it. But we're used to the Calipari coached teams where Kentucky, it's full of future NBA draft prospects where you may have a couple of guys on this roster that find themselves in the NBA, but it's a completely different, approach to building a team compared to what we've seen with Kentucky teams in the past. And so it's very interesting to see them get that win. You've even seen Calipari struggle in the Champions Classic in the last several years. And so I'm sure Kentucky fans are very thrilled to, get the result that they did. I, of course, being an Indiana fan and growing up not necessarily being a fan of Kentucky, I have learned to coexist with them down here. And, I have a lot of friends who are Kentucky fans, but I don't want to see them, do the whole 40-0 nonsense again. I know they never went 40-0, but they got damn near close. And Mark Pope, I'll say this, he seems like a very likable guy. He's the antithesis of John Calipari. It was very, very easy to hate John Calipari. So much so that even Kentucky's own fans hated him at the end of his tenure there, just because he's a larger than life figure, much like Rick Pitino is and was. And a lot of those guys, they just don't, they don't really relate to regular human beings, if that makes sense. They have their own thing. They do things their way. And, it's their way or the highway most of the time. With Mark Pope, it's a lot different, I feel like. And again, I don't wish them the best because it is Kentucky, but he seems like a nice guy. I'll say that. So that's it for the Champions Classic. I've always kind of seen the Champions Classic as something that is, kind of the unofficial tip-off to college basketball season. And I know it's been going on for, the season's been going on for a couple of weeks now, but this is always the first big event that we get for college basketball. And I tell you, one thing I miss that was also kind of an indicator of college basketball season, it was the carrier games. We had Indiana face Kansas in one of those back in, was it 2017? I can't remember why they stopped doing those. Maybe it had something to do with a lot of the condensation getting on the floors. But those games are always cool. The ones that are played on military bases, that type of thing, that used to happen. I feel like that was like literally the week of the beginning of college basketball, if I'm not mistaken. I remember Indiana getting that big win against Kansas, and I feel like that team ended up not being good, if I'm not mistaken. That was I think that was coming off of the year where Indiana went to the Sweet 16 with Yogi Ferrell, and they'd won the Big Ten championship. And then, of course, Tom Crean typically followed up those types of seasons with years that were more along the lines of just, blah and not making the tournament. And it was just not, a fun time. Let's see. Let's go and move on from college basketball real quick. This is, I almost said breaking news, but because this show comes out, it's pre-recorded. Of course, this isn't a live show, but it broke while I was recording a few moments ago. We talked about the Colts. We talked about the Colts having a bunch of issues, right? And just kind of seeming like a sorry organization. Well, they said they were going to be moving forward with Joe Flacco for the remainder of the season. And guess what? They've already walked that back and decided they're going to put Anthony Richardson back as a starter. So if you needed any more of an indication that the Colts really have no idea what they're doing, then there it is. There's your sign, right? And again, I don't care what the Colts do, not necessarily being a Colts fan. I've always enjoyed seeing them have success from afar. Again, never really rooted for them, emotionally the way that I have with the Hoosiers. And that's why, my wife and I have adopted the Bills, with the family ties and that sort of stuff. But it is weird to see how far the Colts have kind of fallen since the glory days of Peyton Manning, and then a little bit with Andrew Luck after that. And I know you made the playoffs last year, but yeah, you end up losing that. I keep saying that. Was it the actual playoffs that they lost to the Texans, or was it a game that decided who went to the playoffs? Again, it doesn't really matter. They lost to the Texans in a pivotal game at the end of last year, and they've been moving backwards, it seems like, ever since. And it's unfortunate. I do wish the Colts, the best of luck. It's not like Kentucky where I just want them to suck. But say Mark Pope is a good dude. It's not the exact same thing. But I just don't understand why it seems like they don't have their crap together, right? I mean, decide on something and stick with it. Ride it out. I think a lot of them are realizing that going with Joe Flacco wasn't going to do them any favors, because Joe Flacco's only got so much time left in his tank, right? Or so much gas left in his tank is probably the better way to phrase it. And, knowing that wasn't giving you any results, they were like, you know what, that was stupid. We need to put in our, I almost said a rookie, but we put in our young guy and just let him ride it out. If he sucks, he sucks. Then, we'll just pay for that later and draft somebody else. So I think that's probably the better decision. But at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, the Colts just really don't seem to have a definitive plan in place for what they want to do for the future of their franchise. So very interesting. And then, of course, sad for them as well. Let's I want to get into a little bit of YouTube comments. Haven't done that in a while. And first of all, I want to give a quick shout out to those for just the well wishes for a safe and healthy pregnancy for my wife, and just very thankful for all the nice things that were said about that. And I do want to read a couple of those that pertain to that offered specific questions or had something that maybe I wanted to shout out, and then we'll move into some, of course, Indiana related questions as well. But Mike says, good show, John. Well, I shouldn't even read that part. I feel like I'm giving myself a nice little pat on the back. Well, thank you, Mike, for the compliment. He says, congratulations on the future addition to your family. Have you two started working on a name list for her? We actually do have a name picked out for our daughter. I'm not going to share it right now on the show, as we have not really shared the name with family just yet. I mean, some family members know what we're going to name our daughter, but I will just wait until I get a chance to talk with most of them about that, and then I'll share on the show what we're going to end up naming our daughter. But thanks for the question, Mike, and thanks for the nice comments. Tana says this. Congrats on the new baby girl, John. Mine just turned 19, got engaged, and you're going to be a grandpa after Christmas. Well, congratulations on all of that to you, Tanis. Appreciate, first of all the shows you've listened to over the years, whether it be here or for the previous show that I worked on, and just all the different stuff. Out of touch. Appreciate you and all the comments you've contributed and the nice things you've said. So congratulations to you and your family on, man, your daughter's 19, she's getting engaged, and you're going to be a grandpa. That is, it's a lot of stuff right there. So congrats to you, Tanis, and appreciate you listening as always. And again, a lot of other people said some nice things about the baby announcements. I'm not going to read all those, but I do appreciate every single one of those. I don't want to make this about that, but I do appreciate it. Let's go ahead and, so one thing that Mitchell and I talked about on Monday, we talked about the darkest day in Ohio State history. A couple of different people, Michael Newberg and Walnut 412, mentioned Earl Bruce was the coach at Ohio State during that time. And Walnut says that this was during his senior year at Indiana. He had shirts they had shirts that had the quote on it, but he doesn't have it anymore. That's pretty cool, though. That's a nice little, it'd be nice if Indiana brought that back out. And I know that this is not a bad Indiana team, of course, but to see a different iteration of that maybe come to fruition if Indiana beats Ohio State, that'd be pretty cool to see, if I'm being honest. So I'm not totally against that. And then Michael mentions that it was 1987 or 88. Was it 2 years in a row they beat Ohio State? Because that's pretty intense. Well, that sounds so childish saying it like that. Matt K says D'Angelo Pons and Jeremiah Smith were teammates in high school, so Pons has faced Smith a lot in practices. That's a very interesting thing to keep an eye on. Thanks for pointing that out, Matt. Of course, Indiana's defender D'Angelo Pons and star wide receiver Jeremiah Smith for Ohio State. That is going to be interesting to see. I mean, really how that matchup plays out. I don't know how often they'll, go toe-to-toe with each other in the backfield. It's not even what you call that part of the field, is it? On the playing field, we'll just say that. But it would be nice to see D'Angelo Pons get a nice little interception that is, a passing route to Jeremiah Smith, because Pons, one of the big standouts for this Indiana defense, especially when it comes to crucial plays like that during different portions of this season. What else we got here? Justin Beard says, as for IU, the bye week couldn't have come at a better time. OSU is who we think they are. I think you're spot on, Justin. And I mentioned this the other day. The bye week, as we've said before, different portions of the season, with the two different bye weeks Indiana's had, I mean, you can only, before you get to that particular portion of the schedule, you can only assume, okay, will this be a good time to take the bye week? And one of them being smack dab in the middle of the season, that seemed like a good opportunity. And of course, after that emotional win against Nebraska, or was it after the Nebraska game? I can't quite remember. It doesn't matter. No, it was before the Nebraska game, because they were bowl eligible after they beat Northwestern on the road. So they had time to prepare for Nebraska. And this time you had a very physical, emotional, win against Michigan, and that came down to the final drive, and Indiana was able to hold off the Wolverines. And I think, as Kurt Signetti mentioned too, as banged up as they are coming out of that game, it's again couldn't be a better time for the bye week if you are Indiana. Let's do a couple of quick hitters before we wrap this thing up here on a Wednesday. And got a few different things that I want to comment on. Some of these are silly. Some of these are, I guess, more serious and kind of funny if you think about it at the same time. We'll start off with something very silly, and that is Syracuse football. Their head coach, he said this the other day, he doesn't shower after losses. And I think that is, I understand the symbolism there, because like you don't feel good after a loss, and maybe you feel like you deserve to just stink, right? Because you feel like you stink. And so why not personify that, make it a reality by making yourself physically smell bad for, the rest of your evening or your day, whatever it may be. And if Syracuse's head coach is married and has someone to sleep with, then I feel very bad for that person if he ends up, smelling as bad as he thinks he might smell. And that's just a very interesting thing. I guess it's maybe an extra motivation to pull off the win too, right? Especially if something like taking a shower is important to you, putting that extra little barrier there as you, hope to win your football game. That's very interesting. I can't imagine someone like Kurt Signetti doing that. But what's funny? I could see Tom Allen doing that. And yeah, that's not a knock on Tom Allen. He just seems like he's more of that type of a character to be like, oh man, I don't shower for games. He'd probably say after a win, you wouldn't shower. I could see that being a Tom Allen thing. That raspy voice after screaming all day long or all game long. Another thing, this is something I'm going to need to be, I was going to say need to be very careful. It's not like it's, the most serious matter in the world, but I want to make sure I read some of this correctly. But this is USC football was recently fined and put on probation for some NCAA violations. They were fined $50,000 and placed on probation for a year due to multiple violations of coaching staff rules over the last couple of seasons. Apparently had something to do with having too many coaches on the staff, more than they were allowed. And I know that number has changed over the last couple of years. And I think because apparently the fine and the way they got in trouble could have been much worse, but USC was very cooperative. And honestly, $50,000. I mean, that seems like it's nothing, right? I mean, especially nowadays with the amount of money you're making with TV contracts and the like, and the amount of money you're going to be allotted for NIL purposes. I believe it's like $22 million. So that $50,000 is like chump change for not only USC, but for any major college football program. Another thing I want to mention real quick before we wrap up. This is something I've had in the back pocket for a couple of days. And this is something very weird that happened. So Auburn, their men's basketball team was traveling to face Houston, and they had to turn their flight around because there were players who were about to potentially get into a big actual fist fight on the plane. And I don't think it ended up escalating to that, but it was bad enough to the point to where it seemed like it was heading in that direction, to where the team plane for Auburn had to turn around and de-escalate things. I cannot imagine if that thing turned into a full-blown, almost said scuffle. That's probably a nice way of putting it. I mean, imagine if people were like shoving each other and throwing each other in seats and potentially, putting yourselves in a position to get horribly injured while you're up in the air like that. I mean, I could see why they would turn it around, but also with Bruce Pearl being the head coach and kind of the way that he carries himself, I hate to say that I'm not surprised by this, but I'm not, under his regime, I should say. But a lot of Indiana fans have said before they'd love to have Bruce Pearl as their head coach, but I also see why. He is a very good coach. He kind of has a Bob Knight style of demeanor, if that makes sense, as does Kurt Signetti, in different ways. I don't want to act like they're the same person, all three of them, because they're definitely not. They're all their own individual human beings and have very distinct things about them, good and bad, I'm sure. But yeah, just very interesting story when it comes to, I mean, players fighting and making the plane turn around. Very, very odd and kind of scary stuff, if we're being honest. So that'll do it for the quick hitters. We'll do non-revenue sports shout outs on Friday. And I know I did them on Friday last week as well because of the special episode we did last Wednesday. So we'll get to those once again on Friday. Thanks again for checking out the show. Subscribe on YouTube. Hit that notifications bell if you feel so inclined to do that. And check out everything going on at HoosierIllustrated.com. And we'll be back to do this all again on Friday. This has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.